Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Pixel Hunt. My name is Samiran Rao and today we're going to be looking at another editing tutorial where we take this photo and make it look like this. If you're a fan of the movie Inception like I am, you probably know what this image is all about. You probably also know what this thing here is. In the movie, it's called a totem.
So a totem, you need a small object, potentially heavy, something you can have on you all the time that no one else knows.
Like a coin?
No.
And a forever spinning totem indicates that you're dreaming. Now, I got this thing on Amazon and it came in this very good looking box here. And when I opened it, I was actually in for a surprise because not only did it have a totem in there, it also had this tiny die. And if you're a fan of the movie, you also know what this die means in the movie.
This is a loaded die.
When I spun this thing for the first time, I was really shocked at how long it kept going. It actually made me wonder if I'm dreaming. Alright, before we start editing the image, let's go over the gear that I used to capture this image. The Canon 60 Mark II, my primary camera. The 100mm Canon f2.8 macro lens. This is a real killer. It lets you go really close to your subject because it's a macro. My settings for this image were shutter speed 1/160, aperture f7.1 and ISO 400. So I also use this aperture light here. I think it's called the aperture A9. It's the light falling on the spinning totem on the left side of the image. This one is a pretty cool light actually. It is pretty bright, so I can just show you. You see that? And it also has this kind of like a plate that you can stick it in front and it kind of diffuses the light. So okay, here we have the image open in Lightroom. We are going to do most of the editing in Lightroom, but we are going to add one tiny layer in Photoshop after we are done with the Lightroom editing. The first thing I noticed is that this thing is not cropped for Instagram, so I'm going to crop it to a 4:5 ratio so that it can be posted directly to Instagram. Okay, now I just want to go to the basic adjustments and reduce the temperature of the whole image to make it look a little bit cooler. Okay, now I'm going to grab a radial filter and draw around the top here. I'm only going to select the top and I'm going to change the shadows here and bring it up quite a bit. Now after this, I'm noticing that the background is getting affected, so I'm going to use a range mask and only select the shadows of this image, which should basically cover the top and leave out the background. Okay, so next I want to go to the tone curve and first make an S curve here to bring up the contrast of the image, but then I just want to bring up the shadows a little bit so that it's not really an S curve, because the shadows in this image have most of the details, so I don't want to darken that part too much. Okay, once we're done with that, I want to go to the reds and increase the reds in the highlights just a little bit. And then I want to go to the blues and increase the blues in the shadows just a tiny bit. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the radial filter that we created earlier and I'm going to increase the clarity and the texture of this top region. And I'm also going to bring down the saturation completely so it's completely devoid of color, basically just black and white except for the tint that we added earlier. I also want to bring up the sharpness of this region quite a bit. Okay, so next I want to play with the HSL sliders a little bit. My goal here is to make the reds pop out a little bit. The dye and the light falling here from the left side, I want them to pop out a little bit, so I'm going to increase the saturation and the luminance of the reds. And I'm going to bring down the luminance of the blues so that the background becomes a little bit more darker. I'm also going to shift the oranges a little bit towards the red so that we have more red saturation here. Okay, now that we've made the reds pop out so much, it looks kind of weird that the white portion on the top is not actually having a red tint to it, because if the lighting is kind of reddish here, then the white part of the top should also be a little bit reddish. So I'm going to add another radial filter here, and I'm going to add a range mask so only the absolute white parts are selected, and I'm going to add a red tint to this. Okay, next I just want to go to split toning, and I want to add a slight orange and teal effect. So I'm going to add an orange to the highlights and a little bit of teal to the shadows. And I want to make sure that the saturation here is set to really low values. Like here I'm setting it to just 8. I don't want this effect to be really explicit, it has to be really subtle. I also want to shift the balance a little bit towards the highlights here so that there's more of an orange tint than a teal tint to the entire image. Okay, so the last thing I want to do in Lightroom is add a little bit of sharpening here. So mainly increase the amount of sharpening, and also just play around with the radius and the masking here. So here is a before and after for the Lightroom adjustments. Now we're going to move this over to Photoshop. Okay, so here we have our image open in Photoshop. The first thing I'll do is create an empty layer. I'm going to call this lights, and then I'm going to grab my brush tool. I'm going to set the size to the maximum available, and then I'm going to select a red color, any color similar to the light that's falling on the left side of the image, and I'm going to just paint once. Then I'm going to set the blend mode here to screen, and then I'm going to paint here a couple more times on the left side, and then reduce the fill of this layer so that it's not so obvious that it has been painted. Now here is the before and after. It's a very subtle difference, but it definitely does enhance the image. Okay, so now that we are done with that, one thing I noticed is that the dye here is attracting a lot more attention than the top. So we need to bring up the brightness, the exposure of the top a little bit more so that the dye isn't grabbing all the attention in this image. So I'm going to add a duplicate layer here just below the screen layer that we created, and I'm going to create a smart object out of it, and I'm going to add a camera raw filter. So now once we have the camera raw filters open, I'm going to grab an adjustment brush and I'm going to paint just over the top. I'm going to make sure none of the background is selected because we don't want to increase the exposure of anything other than the top here. Okay, now that we have the top selected, I'm going to bring up almost everything here, the exposure, the highlights, the shadows, the whites, and even the blacks, just a little bit here. Okay, so that's it for the camera raw filters. Here is the before and here is the after. You can see that it attracts a lot more attention now because it's more separated from the darker background, and that is looking pretty good. I think we can stop here and save this edit. Alright, that was it for this tutorial. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something. If you know of any better way of doing something that I just did in the tutorial and you want to share it with me, please feel free to leave a comment down below. If you liked the video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you've watched the movie Inception, you know exactly what this thing here is.